start by just mentioning a little bit of our team. So we're social scientists, psychologists, myself, Michel Ferrari from Canada, Hyung Bang from South Korea, Rasul Kordonagabe from Iran, and then we have a sociologist, Monica Ardell, originally from Germany, now in the US, a political scientist, ethnographer, Ricca Edmondson, who's here with me, and a cognitive science, Mike Cannell. Yes, we also have two humanists, a Jesuit Christian theologian, and Gilles Mongeau, and a philosopher, John Vervaeke. And everyone's very excited about this project, so we're really going to be involved in, say, all the different aspects of it. So a bit about our project then. Our thesis is that wisdom can act as a key factor in motivating self to virtue. Wisdom is itself a virtue and marshals the other virtues. This is actually a theme I think that's come up in other talks too. What is wisdom? We're taking it in perhaps a more expansive sense than has been used so far, because in some sense wisdom is sometimes talked about as a theoretical, contemplative wisdom pointing towards Aristotle's Sophia. It's a self-transcendent understanding of ultimate, perhaps divine patterns that govern the cosmos. And sometimes it's a personal storied wisdom, say, which is Aristotle's phronesis, which has come up more in our discussion so far. An art of living a virtuous human life through examining one's own life story within communities and sound judgment about how to live virtuously or act virtuously in particular situations. Now, that's actually not, say, novel, but what we are going to say is that wisdom can't be understood outside of the personal, cultural, and religious contexts that frame judgments about wisdom and virtue. Also, wisdom connects self to others, but wisdom involves different understandings of how the self relates to others due to national differences sometimes. For example, Asians are often said to have a self that's more interdependent in self-construal, whereas North Americans have a more independent self-construal. Religious differences, for example, the sense of a Christian or Muslim soul as it relates to the self versus the Buddhist idea of no essential self, as we've heard earlier. And life stage differences. For example, Erickson's view that wisdom is something that's characteristic as a task of later life. These are all ways in which, say, we might understand, say, differences in the way that wisdom will be understood. So what sort of method can bring these various ideas together? In general, we're going to propose two convergent parallel mixed method studies that have 4 faith conditions, 3 nations, and 2 stages of adulthood. And for this amount of data, we have site managers we're proposing for each country who will manage recruitment and data analysis, but in collaboration with the team, as I'll come to later. Our general working hypothesis is that national culture and religious faith will inform individual life experience through implicit and explicit narratives about virtue. Both will interact across the lifespan to develop the moral self and wise motivations to virtue. So more specifically then, 4 faith conditions. We're going to look at Christians, Buddhist, Muslim, and also agnostic faith conditions. And we're going to do that, each of these 4 in 3 different nations. In Canada, in South Korea, and in Iran. And we're going to look at 2 stages of adulthood. So young adult and older adult. And our general procedure is going to be as follows. We're going to have a battery of self-report questionnaires on level of religiosity, wisdom, self-construal, self-transcendence, locus of control, and quality of life. And I can actually give details of those measures if people would like in the question period. And we're going to use those to actually help orient and inform our, say people's performance in a wisdom simulation, which is, in this case, is actually a six rounds of decision making aimed to benefit a fictitious country. You're sort of hired to help that country. You have to make certain decisions. And it allows the performance of a virtuous self, actually in relation to a partner, as can be explained later. We're also going to have 2 interviews. The first interview will be in 3 parts. It will ask people to react to classic stories of Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist wise motivation to virtue. Then we're going to ask about a particular person that they know, and how they motivate themselves to virtue, both in immediate motivation, for example, resisting temptation, and a lifespan developmental motivation to your own personal development through, for example, daily mindfulness meditation or social and public interactions that you might engage in. And we're also going to ask specifically about the role of community in creating and sustaining wise motivation to virtue. In our second interview, we're going to discuss people's simulation performance and also follow up with themes that we will be able to glean from the first interview. Now, just to give a brief sense, these stories will be selected and polished by the team, but the sense of story we mean is something like this. It's a story just roughly that there's a king, and the Buddha asks him, so where are you coming from? And he says, affairs of state, things like that. And the Buddha says, well, what would you do if I told you that if a reliable person came from the east and said, there's a mountain high as the clouds, crushing everything in its path? And what if someone came from the east, south, and west and said the same thing? And the king answers, well, if such a great peril should arise, what else could be done but to live by the Dharma, to live righteously, and do wholesome and meritorious deeds? To which the Buddha says, well, let me tell you then, old age and death are advancing, and nothing can stop them. And so under those, no armies can buy them off. What should you do? And he said, surely under those circumstances, there is nothing else to do but live virtuously and do meritorious deeds. So our point is to show these stories to people from all four faith conditions and get their response to them. What do they think of this? And as a way to sort of understand their own ideas about motivation to virtue. So we're going to propose two studies. First study will have two age groups at opposite ends of adulthood. As I mentioned earlier, 10 emerging adults and 10 older adults in four faith conditions. As I was just saying, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, and agnostic in the three nations. And these are actually chosen to illuminate differences in self. In essence, Canada, administratively at least, remains a Christian nation. Iran is a Muslim republic. And Korea is, at least historically, a Buddhist nation. Of course, no one is denying that there's a pluralism in these societies as well. And that's how we'll find our participants in the other faith conditions. Study 2 will replicate Study 1 with the authorities nominated as wise in the same four faith conditions. So 10 Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist authorities, 10 agnostic wisdom nominees in the same three countries. We're going to use purposive sampling to collect as wide a diversity of views as possible of wise motivation to virtue. And here again we'll have two interviews, but this time interview 1 will replicate Study 1 as before. Interview 2 will ask people to reflect again on their simulation performance and their own first interview, but also on the findings from Study 1. So what did they find? So what do they think of the themes that have been drawn out about wise motivation to virtue from the more general population? Now, the question of deep integration. We have integration of the team. We'll have monthly team meetings, which actually continue into its interdisciplinary discussions that we've had, that many of us have had since 2011. And but now they can be oriented towards the empirical data. And a methodological integration is to converge and orchestrate data from self-report questionnaires, the computer simulation, and interviews. The interviews, of course, themselves can be subject to different kinds of analysis. So theological analysis by Zhou Monzhou, thematic hermeneutic analyses, narrative analysis. These are all different, things that we'd like to do. And achieving the deep integration will involve, let's say, that type of coordination will mitigate weaknesses of particular methods. And for example, the interview analyses informed through the questionnaire data will allow us to identify different levels of wisdom or self-transcendence, different types of self-construal and locus of control. These types of distinctions within the way that people answer the questionnaires can then allow us to identify patterns within the interviews themselves. Extreme cases, might also be used. Theoretically, this integration will allow us to confirm or disconfirm existing factors within the questionnaire measures, but also discover new understandings of self-motivation, wisdom, and virtue through the foreign language interviews. And the convergence will allow us to create a typology of motivations say, of self to virtue in these different nations, different faiths, and at different ages. And here I'll, in terms of challenges.
So both Michel and I have always really worked in an interdisciplinary way. I was trained as a philosopher, but I've always earned my living among sociologists and political scientists. And I do a sort of, what I like to think of as sort of philosophical field work in ethnography. Michel has been working with an interdisciplinary team forever and ever. So we're used to interdisciplinary work, but at the same time, we think it's terribly important not to underestimate the difficulties that this involves, which are really considerable. I think different disciplinary languages, cultures of reasoning, and core concerns really lead to different fundamental models of the human being between disciplines. So, for example, somebody who takes a hermeneutic approach to the way language and meaning are constructed see language as fluctuating, as changing. They see meaning as contributed partly by the interpreter and as affecting the interpreter. And that's a very different approach to meaning from the kind of approach implied by constructing a survey, for example. So this means that there are really deep disagreements within our team, which we think is tremendously productive and important. And we hope to deal with these differences in a very explicit way. I'll come to that on the next slide. There are differences, of course, between just sort of practical differences in terms of how we want to select our sample, differences in how we even conceptualize though and analyze what data is. So for me, contextualized cases are tremendously important as generating meanings, new meanings of wisdom. What does wisdom mean to you or mean to you? Whereas for Michel, for example, it would be very, very important to try to locate patterns between different ages and cultures and religions and so on. So we've got different approaches and aims within the same project, and we think that's tremendously important because we're trying to do qualitative and quantitative work at the same time. This is going to also lead to pragmatic challenges, for example, in analyzing data in foreign languages. And there are many people here very familiar with the translation problems, not just between languages, obviously, but between entire worldviews which are involved. So this is really very exciting because it enables us to try to make explicit some of these differences. So strategies for response include, for example, writing an ongoing project journal about these challenges and how we hope to face them. We're going to have team meetings which are going to be frequent enough, we hope, to preserve the friendship that we have among us. We're going to build on past team experience. For example, Michel has collected already about 600 interviews in places like Iran and Korea. So he's very familiar with working his way around the problems of finding people to interview and the pragmatics of carrying out the interviews. So in summary, our research goal we hope to explore different conceptions of wise virtue with both immediate and longer term wise self-motivations to achieve virtue. We want to look at people in early and late adulthood, in fourth faith traditions and three nations. We hope that this will be innovative in coordinating between different disciplines and converging findings, coordinating findings. We don't exactly know how all those findings are going to fit together. And I think it's important not to assume that this is going to be a smooth process, but the bumpiness of the process is what makes it exciting. And we hope that we'll be able to find out more about dispositions to behavior through narrative and simulation performance, and to problematize scientific discourse about the moral self. We hope to be able to say more about how people conceptualize wisdom in different situations. And Michel, at any rate, hopes to create a more comprehensive typology of self-motivation to virtue. And just at the end, we have a picture which we sort of feel summarizes not only our own hope for interdisciplinarity, but everybody's hopes in this room, because this is a painting which was done together by Bruegel and Rubens, who normally, as you know, have very different styles of painting. But sometimes they were friends. They lived around the corner from each other in Amsterdam, and sometimes they painted together. And characteristically, I think Bruegel would paint the landscape, and Rubens would paint the people in the picture. But the thing is that they both paint differently when they paint together. It alters both of their painting styles, which I think is a lovely thing. I'd also just like to point out that this is a painting of Christ's visit to Mary and Martha, who, as we know, had very different ideas about virtue and how to live a virtuous life. Thank you very much.
I'd like to ask you a little bit more about your conception of wisdom. Now, I think to the West, we imply, maybe this is just me, but we tend to see this as something which the elderly, or at least somewhat old people have, which then raises the question of you looking at younger folks. And of course, maybe this is a culturally embedded type of perception. I hear you talking in that direction. You'll have the three religions, the three countries, and so forth. Do you expect to find some sort of universal aspect of wisdom, or do you expect cultural variation, or some mix of the two, and what are you seeing as wisdom provisionally?
But, that's a great question. Actually, there's a lot of scientific research in the wisdom field. There's a model by Paul Baltes that basically makes the claim that really it's in emerging adulthood that sort of the ability to answer the types of tasks that they give anyways emerge and that don't change throughout life. But that actually is counterintuitive to many people, and others have found through other types of tests that it really is in old age. You find, for example, more integrative sort of understandings or deeper understandings. But I think that there will be, so the sense of the art of living, I think, there's a sense in which everyone will have an opinion about what's the best way they should be organizing their life, and as it will contribute to virtue, as has been said even in the previous time. And I think that's something that you'll find in young adulthood, but my suspicion is that you'll find a different sense and a richer sense in old age. And that's certainly, we have preliminary interviews with people from Canada, and actually also in Iran on this. We have a few interviews from Korea, but we haven't really looked very much at them. And you definitely find, and the people don't find this task very easy to answer. But so we have that as a wisdom, but not about, say, the specific virtue aspect, which for us will be very exciting to pursue further. And that, so this preliminary data does let me say that there are very different types of things that people answer in different countries. Really you can translate them, and it still leaps off the page that this has got to be from, say, another sort of like population that's answered in this way. And that's the sense in which we feel that if we probe about motivation to virtue, that we will get really quite different, possibly different responses, or at least different ways of, say, construing this that will be very fruitful.
I think you could call wisdom a sort of fundamentally contested concept, and there are very, very many versions of what wisdom might be. And I think some of the members of our team have a particular interest in the sort of threefold approaches to wisdom in very abstract terms, in terms of affective and reflective and cognitive components, for example, but you might expect those components to be manifested in very, very different ways in different cultures. At the same time, I, for example, would have a more frenetic and more transactional. I would be interested in what I would see as a more frenetic and more transactional approach to wisdom, because in my research in Connemara, I've seen older people just through little wise jokes or quoting proverbs able to provoke wisdom in other people. And to me, that's a very exciting aspect of wisdom, that it can be transactional and transformative in that way. But at the same time, in a sense, it's nearly not quite the right question to ask us what our concept of wisdom is, because we want the people in our study to tell us. And we want to be as open as we can to trying to reconstruct the conceptions of wisdom that they have. And that's one of the reasons for which we ask them to talk about other people who are wise. Because we found that rather than asking people for reports about their own selves and their own lives, it can often be more useful and provocative, a richer response to ask them to talk about somebody else. It's easier sometimes for people to talk about other people. So in a sense, even though I'm kind of quite proud of the things that I think I've noticed about wisdom in Connemara, in a sense that's not the issue. The issue is what everybody else thinks about wisdom.
Owen.
So, thank you. I wonder if you still think the way you asked the question in your letter of intent is well formed, because it you didn't focus as much on this today, but you're talking more about wisdom today. But in the title, you asked, "Does nation or faith matter more?" And the reason I'm worried about that is I wonder how you're distinguishing. I get how you're distinguishing nations, because you just could say, well, we're talking about citizens of Canada, Iran, or Korea, but there's different senses of is. You say in the proposal, Canada is administratively a Christian nation, but of course it's filled with whatevers. Iran, I think we know, is mostly, I mean, it's administratively Muslim and probably a lot of true believers. I'm puzzled when you say Korea is Buddhist. 20%, I think a little over 20% of Koreans self-identify as Buddhists. So I'm puzzled about that. You're just not going to get, good data about faith. I'm just wondering how you get separate the faith and nation, or identify or individuate them in different countries. Unless you decide, for example, that you're going to study Korean Buddhists, Canadian Christians, Orthodox Muslims in Iran. I agree.
I guess what we were hoping to, by studying members of each faith in all three countries, that you could then establish whether there's something about a conception of virtue that, for example, Christians share across the three different countries, or that Buddhists share across different countries. And admittedly, I think it is open to the possibility that there are many different varieties of Christianity or Buddhism, and also Islam.
So in other words, am I understanding, so you're going to try to find Christians, Buddhists, and Muslims in each of the three countries?
Yes, that's right.
I didn't, thank you.
Yeah, and just in case someone is wondering this, Rasul was just back in Iran and was able to affirm that yes, they can find Buddhists in Iran, and Christians are a protected religion there. So in that sense, and some people, although they won't widely state it, but many people do declare themselves to be agnostic. So,
thank you.
Howard.
As a side note, we've translated Monarch Ardalt's three-dimensional scale into Chinese and given it to 100 or so students at Southwest University, and it relates to things like mindfulness in the same way that we see in the United States. So there's reasonable good extensibility across languages and cultures. But what I wanted to ask you about is, if I recall, Mike Connell's simulation focuses on tragedy of the commons. And if that's true as a specific kind of problem in interaction of resource allocation and use, how do you think about that in respect of the other kinds of measures that you're taking?
No, it's a good question. What we're really hoping to be able to do, because we actually both played the simulation, and so our sense of it was that you have 6 rounds in which you're asked to make decisions that people may not know. The way this is set up is that it's essentially two countries that have limited resources. You need to decide how you're going to say what you're going to do with those resources, and you can either cooperate with the other person, or you can sort of be competitive against them. And I guess our thinking is that although, of course, it's a limited problem, but it does allow the possibility to demonstrate actually certain attitudes towards virtue, or certain ways, because you're also asked to explain the rationale for why you acted the way you did. And so this is the data that we're particularly hoping to use, and also you can see whether people synchronize in the types of actions that they do. So just at a behavioral level, you can see if they are attending to the other. You can also see in terms of their answers whether they're sensitive to the other, they're concerned about them. Whether also you can say chat with people, whether they actually engage in conversations. So all of these will be ways in which you'll get some sense of their understanding of virtue. And we're hoping to triangulate it then with the questionnaires and the interviews.
Have you played the game? It's actually quite fun. It's surprising.
Well, we are out of time, so thank you very much.